how do we define it, what should we do about it? And I'm going to talk about this partly from my experience. As you heard, I was the business secretary for 5 years. It's a bit misleading because the business secretary, when I was in, was primarily the Minister for Universities, Tech Colleges, Science Institutions, Trade, and there was some business as well. And also, the Conservatives labelled me the anti-business secretary. So I'm not quite sure that I totally fit the job description that you want. I'm drawing probably on my experience. Sorry, are we? Partly on my experience in government, but before I was in government, I was with Shell, the international oil and gas company. I was their chief economist, and obviously part of that job was interacting with government. And now I'm retired from politics. Amongst the various things I do, I have a business, or I'm director of a business dealing with hydrogen infrastructure for the low carbon economy as it emerges. So I'm partly speaking as a former politician who dealt with business, partly as a business executive in a big company, partly as a budding entrepreneur in my 80s. But I think the useful starting point is the headline in the Sunday newspaper, which was Andrew Rawnsley: Labour mustn't be starry-eyed about its whirlwind romance with big business and the city, which I think is quite a useful tag. How should a political party that wants to get into government relate to business in general and big business in particular? And I will divide what I want to say into two parts. Probably trying to describe how I see the relationship as it is, and then some of the things that we might do of a democratic nature to improve that relationship. But when we're talking about things as they are, just to make a few introductory comments. The first, which I think is absolutely crucial, is that politics is national, but big business is international. They're different animals and they operate from different perspectives. If you think a little bit about some of the companies which own big chunks of the British economy, I dealt extensively with the car industry, which is predominantly owned by companies which are registered in Germany, France, the United States, India, amongst others. If you think about some of the marques that we traditionally identify with the UK, Rolls-Royce is German, Aston Martin wasn't so recently Arab-owned, now Canadian-owned, Jaguar Land Rover is Indian-owned, and that's very much the nature of big business. If you look at the British steel industry, or what's left of it, the big owners, one is Chinese, the other is Indian. Our biggest electricity supplier is producer, rather than distributor, is French. If you take a British brand, like take one or two examples, British Airports is predominantly Spanish, but with a small Chinese shareholding, and you could run through much of the British economy, and you have that distribution of ownership. You take something like the Body Shop, which we identify with Anita Roddick, kind of British innovation, now French, and across the economy you have that kind of story, and people tend to be a little bit worried about that. But of course, think of the other way around, that many British companies, or British-based companies, are highly international and have as much impact on overseas economies as foreign companies do in the UK. I mean, I used to work for Shell. Very, very little of Shell's profits actually come from the UK. There was all sorts of great confusion. If you remember, there was a big demand that oil companies should be contributing their excess profits to dealing with the cost of living crisis in Britain. Actually, most of its profits occur in Australia, Canada, Nigeria, and elsewhere. It's not British, and yet it's probably the biggest supply of dividends to British pension funds. Or if we take AstraZeneca, which produced the vaccine that many of us benefited from during the pandemic, a lot of AstraZeneca's profits come out of China, where it's proved to have an extremely successful overseas business. So my basic point is that big business is international. It's not national. It doesn't naturally match the aspirations of democratic politicians. I think my second general point relates a little bit to the first, which is that when you vote in a democratic election, you're voting for a brand, a party brand. The Labour, you have a Labour politician. If you have a Lib Dem, you have a Lib Dem politician, and you know in a general sense of what they're about. But business brands are wholly different from what lies under them in terms of their ownership structure. Barclays have absolutely no connection whatever to whoever Mr. Barclay was. They happened to be originally Quaker family which established the bank. What you do need to understand when you're dealing with a company, who owns them. And almost all British public companies, in other words, companies operating in Britain, which are public in the sense that their shareholders, their shares are traded. If you look at their share register, it will consist of institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, hedge funds, wealth managers, Fidelity. It will consist of overseas institutional investors. You probably find, if you look at the share register of a company like BP or Royal Mail, that its shares, or some of them, will be owned by Californian teachers or Australian health service employees, or pension or wealth funds from Norway or Temasek from Singapore. And that's what its share register will be made up of. And those that are not public companies, where the shares are not traded on open markets, are private companies. And we tend to think of private companies as having a very clear sense of identity. Let's say Bamford, who owns the trucks that we see on building sites, or Timpsons, who run these very enterprising, public-spirited shoe shops. But actually, private companies will invariably be private equity. And then you will have another group of companies which are publicly owned. There aren't many of them left, but there are a few. There's this LNER that I came up on this morning. There is the post office, God help us, nationalised industry. And I think NatWest is still just about a publicly owned enterprise, though there aren't very many of them. Anyway, my central point is that the brand that you vote for in an election, with a very clear sense of ownership and structure, is completely unlike that of big business, which are owned by very dispersed groups of people drawn from all over the world. And I think my third point is that if in a democratic voting system, you operate on the basis of one person, one vote. But of course, in the business world, some companies are more equal than others, predominantly on the basis of size. I mean, we have, I think, in the UK, something like 5.5 million companies. But of those 5.5 million, 4 million are self-employed. Quite a lot of us are sort of registered as companies. But there's about 1.5 million that actually employ other people. But of those, the vast majority are small companies, handful of workers. Probably 20,000 are what you would normally call medium-sized companies, 50 to 100 to 200 people. And then there's a small handful of the very big companies. And that's, I think, a very important point to understand the relationship between politicians in government and business, because inevitably you can't engage with 4.5 million people, 5.5 million people. You engage with the relatively large ones because they're important to the economy, they employ a lot of people, and certainly in the UK, part of our national kind of mission, if you like, is about attracting inward investors. But all incoming governments are primarily concerned, if they're dealing with business, with holding on to our big international investors. And the disaster if, say, Nissan decided to close down its operation here and walk somewhere else. So you are inevitably focused on the big guys rather than the small. The way in which I dealt with this in government, I suppose I hope most of my successors did it in a similar way, is that every 3 months, whatever, you meet representatives of the big business groups. For example, I think every 3 months I would meet the CBI, the Institute of Directors, that's directors not necessarily tied to particular companies, the Chambers of Commerce, the Federation of Small Business, and MAID, the engineering employers. And I would also meet the TUC to get the trade union perspective. But that isn't, of course, that's the formal structure. Very big companies would tend to assume that if they had a major problem, they could come and talk to a minister and preferably the Secretary of State. So if there were companies that had major issues, they would be in my office every few months, often more regularly. I got to know the heads of business, Brighton Tata, for example, who owned through Tata, Jaguar Land Rover, and also the steel industry in South Wales. I would, if they had problems with their steel business, they would assume that they could come in and talk to the business department. Now, that was the nature of the relationship because they were a major company. In addition, certainly in the government I was in, Mr. Cameron operated through a system of what were called relationship managers, that each Secretary of State or Minister would be allocated a group of companies to look after. Right? The assumption was that these are companies we desperately want to keep in the UK. They're important for employment, tax revenue. You have to have one ear open to any concerns they might have. I think I was allocating Tata, Huawei, the big Chinese telecoms companies that later became quite controversial, and the big oil companies, Shell, because I knew something about it, and BP. You know, people have criticised this relationship manager structure, but it was a way in which governments engaged with business in a reasonably transparent way. Everybody knew who we were allocated. And then the Prime Minister would set up what would be called a business advisory group. And some of the companies I've mentioned, Tesco, Sainsbury's, big retailers, others would come to Downing Street every few months and would let off steam about all the things that were concerning them. And in addition to that, as a Secretary of State, I would go out every week, and I saw it as part of my job, to go around the company visiting factories, offices, sometimes small businesses. I would always try to make a point of talking to the trade union reps, but for the most part, you're obviously talking to the bosses. And I think I probably got around almost all the big company operations in the UK. I mean, that's how business operated in relation to government. So that's, I hope that's a reasonably clear picture of what is, who companies are, how we relate to them in government. The second part of what I wanted to say was about, is this right? Should it be done in a different way? What should we expect of government's relationship with business in a democratic setup. I think the first thing you'd want to say is that business should be compliant with the law at the very least. I mean, that's your minimum expectation, that business should obey the law. Now, having said that, it's actually more complicated than just that bold statement. If you take something like tax, right, we would hope and assume that companies based in the UK pay tax to the British government, but you very quickly discover that big international companies have very complex tax structures, and they're not going out of their way to pay more tax than they need to. So they will, almost all the big international companies will route some of their subsidiaries through tax havens of some kind. Some of the tax havens are regarded as perfectly respectable, the Isle of Man and Guernsey. Some of them, like the Cayman Islands, are not regarded as particularly reputable. But nonetheless, most of the big businesses you're dealing with will have that kind of structure. So what do you say to them? Go away, you're not paying your taxes? Or do you want them here because actually they nonetheless pay quite a lot of tax, and there's probably nothing much you can do about it anyway? There are a whole lot of sort of grey areas. What do you regard as the limits of legitimate lobbying? I've described to you the sort of frequent interactions I would have with big businesses, part of my job, part of serving the country. But when does that become unhealthy? When does it strain at the barriers of legal compliance? I mean, I got into quite a lot of trouble in government because of my comments about Mr. Rupert Murdoch, News Corp. But of course, they were lobbying, well, we thought at the time perfectly legally. We now discovered that maybe it wasn't legal. In fact, there is a big litigation taking place, of which I'm part actually, which suggests they may not have been acting legally. But there is a lot of fairly intensive lobbying around the everyday interactions that you have with big business. There's a sort of grey area. So you'd expect business to be compliant with the law, but recognizing that in the real world, you're very often dealing with a grey area. One of my jobs in government was arms export license, which is mostly pretty uncontroversial. People sending a bundle of rifles to some country, and somebody has to make out a certificate to approve it. But sometimes it would be very controversial. I was having to make decisions around bombs to Saudi Arabia, Saudi Air Force to drop on hospitals. That kind of issue I was trying to stop in the event, but and you have this tricky relationship with BAE Systems, which is one of our biggest manufacturing companies, happens to be one of our biggest armaments producers. So what exactly is our relationship with them? And how are we trying to promote them, because they're an advanced manufacturing company that's providing a lot of very high quality employment in the UK. Many of the things are perfectly legal, providing they have a certificate from the government. Bombing in another country is perfectly legitimate from an export licensing point of view. Well, I'll just take one tricky example. There was a lovely company called Subsea 7, some of you may have heard of it, one of our highest tech companies based in Aberdeen, part of the offshore industry. And they came to my department wanting approval to export one of their inventions, which was a new system for rescuing people who were trapped in submarines. And one of the countries that had problems with defective submarines was Russia. You may remember the Kursk disaster. Because it was controversial, the issue came to me for approval. I thought there was no problem selling this technology to Russia. After all, it's basically humanitarian activity. But then other departments of government popped up and said, no. Russia is dodgy, dangerous, adversary. You can't give them quasi-military technology. So, you know, the essential point I'm trying to make is that you may have a formal legal structure, but within that, there are a whole lot of sort of grey areas that, as a minister, you have to make determinations. I think the second thing I would say about government and business is that there are a whole lot of activities which are entirely legal, but where, if you're particularly in a reforming government, you might want to get business to do. And certainly when I was Secretary of State, we had about 4 or 5 different programs, but for all of them, we actually required business cooperation because they weren't legal requirements. So let me just take one example. One is diversity. Now, of course, all companies are required to observe the law on non-discrimination. But beyond the legalities of non-discrimination, you wanted companies to be positive by employing women, employing ethnic minorities. And one of the features of the British business scene is that the boards of directors of the leading FTSE companies have very few women. Well, they did. And I took an initiative to try to promote women on boards. And we worked really hard on it. You know, I wrote letters to all the top 100 companies saying, you know, you must have at least one woman on the board, preferably the majority. We worked with every different sector, and some of them were very tricky. If you're a mining company called like Glencore, they will shrug their shoulders and say, well, we don't have women doing mining. Don't expect them to have women on our boards. And I had some very conversations which I wish I'd recorded with Mr. Blazelberg, who was the chief executive, making all kind of what would now be regarded as highly misogynist comments about it. But then the simple point is that government wanted to promote diversity, and you had to do it with a mixture of flattery and bullying, and trying to cajole them into a direction that you wanted to go. A second example, which we took very seriously when I was Secretary of State, was around workers' conditions. When as it happened, the Conservatives in the coalition were trying to dilute workers' rights, their ideology. I was trying to do the opposite and strengthen. And so the issue arose in government: how do you improve the condition of workers around issues like 0 hours contracts? And when I first understood about the 0 hours contract, my instinct as a Secretary of State was saying, well, we've got to abolish it. This is terribly unfair. But then we did a consultation and we did a survey of 1,000, 2,000 people who were on minimum hours contracts. And surprise, surprise, we discovered that the majority actually rather liked 0 hours contract. We hadn't expected at all. So if you were a kind of a student, you want to be able to pop in and out without fixed commitments. If you're a single mum with a child who may be well one day and sick the next, you don't want to be tied to a rigid contract. If you're a pensioner trying to earn a bit of extra money. So it turned out that 0 hours contracts were a much more complex phenomenon than we had imagined. So what I did was to bring in legislation that outlawed certain practices relating to a 0 hours contract. We found, for example, that all the butlers and people helping in Buckingham Palace were on contracts. We didn't allow them. They were tied to the 0 hours in Buckingham Palace, but they weren't allowed to work for anybody else. So we outlawed that kind of monopolistic practice, but we accepted that it was a much more complex problem. So as a minister in government, you're trying to steer business in a certain direction. You can use legislation, but for the most part, you're trying to persuade them to operate in a better way. And a very good illustration of that, also in the labour market, was about the issue of top pay. You know, every time we discover that a highly paid executive in the UK is paid X million pounds, there's normally an uproar in the press. Government should do something about it. This is very unfair. We're getting greater and greater inequality. And I decided, well, yes, we have to do something about this. And maybe the thing to do was accept the advice from some of the campaigning groups that we need to have a fixed ratio between the average pay and the people at the top, so we don't have greedy chief executives pocketing an enormous amount of pay. But when we reflected on it and did some consultation, we realized this was producing some absolutely absurd results. It turned out, for example, that the differential in John Lewis partnership was far worse than in Goldman Sachs, for a very simple reason. The John Lewis partnership is a retailer with vast numbers of fairly low paid, comfortably paid staff, whereas Goldman Sachs is a relatively small investment bank, mostly comprising billionaires. So the differential formula simply didn't work. So what we had to do was divide the formula, which provided incentives to business to behave better rather than compelling them. And so we got in law which required shareholders to actually approve through a vote the pay package of their senior executives. Some people have said subsequently that's a bit weak. Why didn't you put workers on the board? But what does it mean, putting a worker on a board? I mean, if you have an international mining company, why would you put a British worker on the board? Most of the employees are working in Australia, South Africa. So I'm choosing that as an example of the kind of behavioural change that you want to try to do if you're a radical reforming government, and some of the practical problems of actually doing it, because it essentially requires the consent of business. These are not things that you easily compel. And to take an even more important example, one of the things I was trying to change in my 5 years was the short-termism of British business. The fact that so many decisions which affect the country are made by businesses on the basis of short-term results, you know, quarterly results, or even a year. And if you're, for example, Rolls-Royce, you need to plan ahead, you know, 20 years for your next generation of engines. And how can you do that when you have shareholders who are just interested in the dividend or the shareholder return that they get in the next few months? So how, as a government, do you try to change that? And I set up initially a group of people under a man called Professor John Kay, who some of you may have come across, a very interesting, thoughtful man, and some others, institutional investors from forward-thinking companies, and tried to come. Eventually, to my great disappointment, they came back and said, well, actually, there's nothing much you can do. You can only change the culture. How do you change the culture of institutional investors like pension funds? Very difficult. So we did a few tweaks to the system. We introduced a requirement on the competition authorities, the takeover panel, to take long-term decision making into account. I changed the so-called fiduciary duty on companies, always to serve their shareholders, to build in that they didn't need to do it on the basis of short-term results to get them more long-term in their app. But the biggest thing we did was to establish what we call the industrial strategy, working on a partnership basis with the car industry, the aerospace industry, the biotech industry, offshore wind, nuclear, and so on, and simply getting the companies around the table with government and trade unions, preferably, and try to develop a sort of corporate approach. I went into government as a sort of old-fashioned kind of liberal free trader, but actually, as a result of being in government and seeing how the system works and how you got results, I finished off as a, I suppose, as a thoroughgoing corporatist, you know, recognizing that you had to operate in this collaborative way with big companies, otherwise you never got any results. So, first of all, you know, we want legal companies to be legally compliant. Then we want them to do things, which I think you have to do by trying to develop this kind of cooperative framework. But what are the other things that we probably haven't done enough of to get a more genuinely democratic approach to big business? Well, I would say, first of all, we need probably more transparency. We have some. I think when companies visit ministers, it's all now recorded. You can get the information through a parliamentary question. One of the things I set up was what's called a register of ownership. So you can go to a register and find out who actually owns particular enterprises, which is previously secret. What I've now discovered is that there are, I think, 100 national interest exemptions that were allowed under the subsequent Conservative administration. So the system has been undermined. But nonetheless, it is now more transparent, and you can find out the beneficial ownership of companies that operate in the UK. You couldn't before. But the more transparency, the better. Because, you know, journalists can get access to what's going on. Parliament can question people. So transparency is one key requirement. I think a second is that we need to beef up the institutions which monitor and enforce action on competition rights. One of the big things that we've lost through Brexit is a very strong set of institutional protections against the abuse of monopoly. The European Commission, rather bureaucratic, legalistic in many ways, but a very effective buttress against the abuse of monopoly power through their competition directive. And also against the abuse of state aids, because of course one of the things which inevitably happens if you're hobnobbing with leading companies, they will say, well, if you want us to invest, we're going to need a bit of inducement, aren't we? You know, can you make us available £100 million to set up a new plant in this area with sort of unemployment? It's very difficult to say no, you know, with lots of political pressure to do it. So you need some countervailing force in government to act as a check on the abuse of competition and the abuse of state aids. And we had that in Europe, and we no longer have it. I mean, as it happens, the Competition and Markets Authority is a genuinely independent body. It's been recalibrated by this government, and it does seem to be doing quite an effective job. And they're even now willing to take on some of the big American platform companies like Google, Meta, and so on, if they act in an anti-competitive way in relation to things in the UK. But that whole process needs very much strengthening. And I think probably the The final thing I will make in this regard is we need a much more effective process for monitoring inbuilt monopolies. Because one of the things which happens within government, particularly arising from government procurement, is that there are certain companies which simply by virtue of their size and the complexity of their business they're operating have a virtual monopoly of knowledge and are able pretty much to charge what they like. I mean, we've had the controversial example of Fujitsu in recent months. When I was in government, the more worrying case was BAE Systems, which was our biggest advanced manufacturer in the area of defence equipment. And if you're building frigates or a new tank, the Army, the Navy will probably have, thousands of specifications that they want to add to this piece of equipment. And the only people who really understand what's involved is the company. And we don't really have any alternative but to use them. Otherwise, Britain no longer has any kind of defence industry at all. And moreover, because the issue requires so much expertise, BAE Systems will probably have 20 or 30 senior executives embedded in the Ministry of Defence on a temporary secondment, simply to help the government. But of course, helping the government, you do it in a way that makes sure that your company is properly remunerated. And there are several areas where the relationship between a big corporate is virtually part of the government, and it's virtually impossible to disentangle the relationship. That's why organisations like the National Audit Office are absolutely crucial for having a very close sort of laser focus on these transactions and what happened. Of course, they can only act retrospectively, but they need to be as strong as possible. And of course, the NEO is essentially a parliamentary institution, and this is one of the ways of keeping tabs on it. But the final point I would want to make, and one thing Michael suggested in his original letter to me, is could we make relationships with business healthier if we had a wider type of ownership, instead of dealing with international companies with dispersed share ownership of private equity, British foreign, if we had socially minded companies, mutuals, workers' cooperatives, and so on. And I, as an individual, I strongly believe in this, and it's very much part of the liberal tradition. But it is highly problematic, and I think if this is something we want to promote, we've got to be honest about the extraordinary difficulties which this kind of non-profit institutions have had in the past. Let me just take one or two examples. The first are the mutually owned companies, which were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, very powerful in the finance sector. Much of banking and insurance was controlled by mutual building societies and mutual insurers. Most of that has disappeared, partly because of the way that mutuals necessarily work. You had a problem of so-called carpetbaggers, where somebody would have was a part owner of a mutual, and would simply say, well, I want my money back. And if they were well organized, they could effectively cripple the building societies, which is why many of the building societies converted into banks. They couldn't stop their members converting it into banks in order to make a capital gain out of the value of their holding. Eventually, we passed legislation to stop it, which helped to keep the Nationwide Building Society in play, but it was difficult. And then you run into another problem with mutuals, which is how do they raise their capital? I mean, if you're a shareholder-owned institution, you go to their shareholders and you raise money in the markets. But how does a mutual raise money? Very difficult, except through retention of profits. But you don't have a market to go to raise share capital. What one of them has done, which is the West Bromwich Building Society, is form a partnership with a hedge fund, I think, and raise capital through them. But then the question arises, are you still a mutually owned institution? You've got around one of the difficulties of mutuality, but you rendered part ownership to a fairly aggressive private firm. And then another problem arises with social enterprises more generally, which is about raising capital. I know this personally because I was for a while chairman of a big social enterprise with a turnover of almost 100 million, really quite a big bus company, doing very well, competing against Stagecoach first, all the rest of them, and performing a very valuable social function because we made sure that transport was available to people, disabled people and so on, who wouldn't otherwise have access to it. But we were first of all hit by Russian hackers, and then by the pandemic, and then by higher diesel charges. And because you're a social enterprise, a charity, you can't just go out and raise more money. You can borrow, but then if you borrow, you're very much dependent on the covenants you have with the banks. And the banks will often be deeply conservative in the way they expect servicing of their debt obligations. So eventually we had to close our doors, and the social enterprise movement has thousands of members, and lots of very good small social enterprises, and God bless them. But running a very big social enterprise in competition with PLCs, private equity finance companies, is extraordinarily difficult. You have one hand tied behind your back because you can't raise equity capital. And the same is true of workers' controlled enterprises. Again, it's a wonderful concept. We only have, I think, two really big ones in the UK. One is John Lewis, and the other is Arab, the I think architectural infrastructure company. Very, very good, and they're okay. But you saw over the last 2 years some of the problems that John Lewis has had. I mean, they're a very, very well run retail company, but they're run by their members, and they have to approve all big changes. It was perfectly obvious that John Lewis, through Waitrose, were struggling in the retail market. You've got these very aggressive new companies coming in, Lidl, Aldi in the retail sector. Waitrose is finding it difficult to maintain its offer. They were losing market share. They brought in Sharon White, this very able woman who was senior Treasury official, after that Ofcom chief executive, and they simply couldn't engineer the kind of radical surgery that was going to be needed to compete. They're now really struggling to maintain their presence in the market. They can no longer pay a dividend to their employees until they get themselves sorted out. So running a workers' controlled operation in a highly competitive market is very, very difficult. So that's really all I have to say. I don't want to finish on a negative note. I think there are many things that could be done in the areas I've described with better transparency, experimenting with new types of ownership. But these things are hard, and I've described in government some of my experiences. I think, given where we are, a large part of being a business secretary, being any kind of hopefully reforming party in government, you have to work with the grain, with big business, because it's a globalized world, and you have to attract inward investment, and you have to keep the people that you've got. And that requires a collaborative rather than a confrontational approach. And that may conflict with a kind of idealistic version of competitive markets. I hope that's helpful.
We do have time for a few questions. For those in the building, we do have a working microphone. For those on Zoom, if you put your questions into chat, Eric will look after those and make sure they get fed in. So over to you for questions.
Okay, Vince, Rachel has asked, what do you make of free ports and special economic zones?
I think in general it's a terrible idea. It was one of Mr. Cameron's passion when I was in the government, and we set some of these things up, and they required an enormous amount of time and effort, and government giving incentives, which very often were really just an incentive for companies to move to the other side of the road. You know, if you're operating on one side of the road and you're paying business rates, taxes and customs duty, and they offer you the opportunity to relocate to somewhere where you don't pay, it's because you're going to move. I fear that's probably what is happening with some of the free flow. You can build in protections to make sure, or try to make sure people don't abuse the system, but it's actually not a very good idea, and it's a distraction from the real challenges which face companies. I mean, there is a real issue about business risk, and how do you reform the system? Simply saying to a particular group of companies willing to operate in a particular park that you can be exempted doesn't solve the problem of effective system of business taxation.
One of the suggestions about the post office and sort of how to improve it was that to exercise the option of converting it into a mutual or a worker-owned structure of some variety. I think the TUC raised it earlier this week. Barring the economic problems that the post office has at the moment, how likely do you think, if they were worker-owned, would the miscarriage of justice that happened regarding the post office, do you think that would have still happened if they were worker-owned, essentially?
Well, I think it wouldn't. Actually, there is a story behind this which is not being made public at the moment, which, I mean, at the moment, there's a lot of anger, but it's a terrible, terrible miscarriage of justice. And there is a kind of, I suppose, an understandable wish to find a scapegoat, somebody to blame. Right? And in the political sphere, people are pointing the fingers at Ed Davey was one of the ministers who actually was a very good minister and probably did more for the post office than the other 18 ministers of the post office that there was over this period. And there are two reasons for that. And one is that when we came into government, one of our objectives was to stop the collapse of the network. What had been happening is that every decade, half the post office network was disappearing. They're just not viable businesses. And the people running post offices were, getting something below the minimum wage, and there was a reduced footfall and with a very old-fashioned system of management, and certainly under previous Conservative and Labour governments, most of our branch post offices were actually closing, and certainly rural areas were being left completely stranded. We made a commitment when I came into the government that we were going to stop this by getting some money from the Treasury to help modernise the post office so that they could offer a competitive service. And actually we did. We were successful. There was no net closures of the post office in our 5 years in office. It was a big success story actually for the Lib Dem, but nobody cares anymore because it's been overtaken by this terrible scandal. But it was actually a big success. And Ed was involved in doing it. And then secondly, and related directly to your question, it was very clear to us, and it's certainly clear to me because I'd had lots of constituency work in the 13 years before I went into government, that the post office was a terrible employer and dealt very badly with this. But we didn't know anything about the horizons. But in general, they dealt with their postmasters very badly. And so we decided, and this was when we came into government, that a better model would be to convert the post offices into a mutual, so that the postmasters actually owned it. And we worked, and Ed particularly, worked with the Postmasters Federation, which is a kind of trade union for the postmasters, and with the post office to try to deliver this model. And we got quite a long way with it. The Treasury didn't like it because they didn't think that this model would be viable and they would have to subsidise it, etc. So they weren't keen. But what we did do was when the Royal Mail was split off from the post offices, we put into the legislation the option that the post office could convert into a mutual. And it's a pity in retrospect that people didn't know that that David was declining the second invitation to lead the protest group. He was actually working on the mutualisation of the post office, which would have provided a stake in decision making to all 10,000 post offices.
So Vincent, I wonder whether you could say something about improving productivity. That seems to be something that is a problem for this country at the moment. How do government and business work together on achieving success?
So that's, you know, to use a cliche, sort of $64,000 question. If we knew how to raise the trend growth in productivity, the country would be richer and happier and so on. But what has happened, if you look at the numbers, and I did some regressions on this some time ago, is that ever since the Second World War, the growth of factor productivity, to use a bit of economic jargon, in the UK has been constant until 2008. It didn't matter whether you had a Margaret Thatcher or Blair or Harold Wilson, the economy kept growing, or the productivity kept growing at a fairly constant but low rate. And it meant that until 2008, there was a kind of, the economy was producing a sort of dividend, right? And that was financing, you know, better services, higher living standards, and so on. Not in a spectacular way, because as you know, the UK economy has not been a stellar performer, but it did mean that everybody was getting better. After 2008, the growth of productivity stopped. The financial crisis delivered a terrible shock to the British economy. It was much worse than I think awareness. I think at the time everybody was very shaken to see banks going down, that we'd all moved on. But actually, it's left 15 years later a serious legacy. The way the metaphor I often use, it was like the country having a massive heart attack. And you know, you can recover, and you give it adrenaline and all that, and medical treatment, which is of course in the form of quantitative easing, kept the patient alive, and we've now gone back to what we regard as normal. But actually, the body has been fundamentally damaged by the financial crisis. The way it manifested itself was in the drying up of credit to small business and small to medium-sized business. And so when I came into government, if you were say an exporting company that didn't have a great deal of collateral, that was a kind of innovative, forward-looking company, the kind of companies that drive productivity, but you couldn't get bank credit for love of money. And I was having to shout at the banks, making myself very unpopular by saying, for God's sake, you know, you people are letting the country down, and It made a lot of bad words. And eventually, things, when they'd sorted out their balance sheets and written off the bad debts, we got back to something like normal. And the government did do things. One of the things I set up was the British Business Bank, which was there to finance business through the pandemic, which was provided supply of credit to companies that don't normally get it. And we have improved the institutional structures a bit. The supply of finance, I would put number one on the list of things to do. Number two is improving the productivity of the labour force. And we have deep-rooted problems at the educational level. The school leavers isn't keeping pace with other countries in Europe or China or wherever. We're falling behind because of schooling system. But we tried to compensate for that in government by resurrecting apprenticeships. We've made a bit of headway with it, but quite a long way behind. The level of vocational training in the UK is not impressive. So that's the second area that you need for productivity improvements. And there are others, but I would highlight those two things in particular. And I would hope the new government, when it comes in, will focus on that. But it's a long-term thing. It's like turning around an oil tanker. You can't just switch things around and get results in a few months. You don't.
Vince, I've got a question on the chat from Elizabeth. She asks, how would you start a conversation with business about moving forward on more sustainable green practices?
Well, I'm surprisingly, I think in many ways, the big business is actually ahead of government and in many ways ahead of the public on this issue. For a very simple reason that if you're in say the car industry or the aerospace industry, you have to plan 10, 20 years ahead. And I think most of the big companies, certainly on the manufacturing side, who operate in the UK, have got the message a long time ago that there isn't really a sustainable future in old-fashioned internal combustion engines and the equivalents in other sectors. And they have been trying to change. So when the government has a wobble, as Mr. Sunak discovers that green things are both losing, business, well, it's first of all worried because they've committed their shareholders' money to these long-term projects and discovers the government's ratting them. But I think in general, I'm inclined to ignore it. The politics is sort of background noise. And it's undoubtedly the case the next election, you are going to get lots of Conservatives and certainly the Reform Party saying we need to forget all this quote green crap. But I think actually the biggest champions will be in big business because they operate globally and not just in the UK. So the fact that Britain is backsliding, they're having to deal with rapidly growing countries in Asia where they are fixed on environmental issues. And if the British car industry doesn't adapt, there are Chinese electric vehicles waiting to come in their millions, sitting there now. They'll come next year, the year after. Cheaper, better than anything being produced in Europe. And if our companies don't adapt to the green technology, they're going to be slaughtered. One of the specific things that we did in government was to set up the Green Investment Bank. I was very much in the middle of it with Chris Hume, who you may remember, who was the Energy Secretary at the time, and we negotiated with the Treasury, and the Treasury said, no, we don't want setting up some new body which can borrow money, because that's the government's borrowing requirement. So we were initially checkmated, but we kept negotiating with the Treasury, and eventually we got a compromise. They gave us 2 billion to create an equity base for the Green Investment Bank. And on the back of that, we leveraged 10 billion from the market, or the bank did, we weren't hands-on then. And certainly by the end of the coalition, the Green Investment Bank had a balance sheet of about 12 billion, which was standing behind quite a lot of the wind farms in the North Sea, things like replacing all the light bulbs in Glasgow with long life street lighting. And they're actually doing a lot in terms of green transformation. But then when we left government, Mr. Sajid Javed, who replaced me, wanted to undo what we'd done ideologically. And he and his successor sold off the Green Investment Bank to an Australian company called Macquarie, who have simply absorbed it into their business. Fortunately, somebody, I think in the House of Lords, slipped in a clause when the privatisation happened to keep the government golden share. So the government still has a foothold in the reinvestment bank. And if there's a change of government, what I'm advising them to do is to utilise the golden share to bring it back as far as possible into our public sector, with a structure rather similar to what it had before, or maybe just in partnership with Macquarie. We can't renationalise. So there is a ready-made banking vehicle for financing big green projects. I suggested to Mr. Ed Milligan that that's a much better way of doing it than simply starting from scratch with his 38 billion, which is never going to happen.
Thank you. I think we should probably draw to a close and thank Vince greatly. Michael, I think you were going to say a few words of thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Vince, for making the trip northwards. I know it's not too much of an imposition from your York background. I first met Vince almost 40 years ago at the start of the Alliance. And it's not unknown that I had concerns about the incompatibility of various philosophies. And some members of the SDP were very abrasive. But one of those who was not at all like that was Vince. And I think we've seen tonight the thoughtfulness and the willingness to interact with what is going on around the nature of politics, which in fact invested that discussion that we used to have in those far-off days. Politics is a complex business. The problem you've got may be fairly easy, and the solution you want may also be easy, but getting from one to the other is intensely complex. And we've been treated tonight to a very interesting address on some of those problems and ways and means of possibly solving them. So we are very grateful to you for coming and applying a certain amount of intellectual rigour to the whole question of big business in politics. Thank you very much.
Just a reminder that we have our next meeting on the 12th of the month when we hear about the pedestrian brothers plant importers of the early parts of the 16th, 17th century. Again, it will be a fascinating evening. So I really hope to see you there.
What's the connection? Is it healthy? How do we define it? What should